Hello dear viewers of my channel, here is the new part of the manhwa. Tomorrow at the same time I intend to release Lloyd, so be sure to wait. I want to thank you for your support, and for the comments you write. Thanks guys. And here's a guy who was lucky enough to be in this video, and if you also want a chance to be in the video, then write something in the comments and maybe you'll be the one in the next video. Enjoy watching. Friends, the soldiers instantly crossed their swords, after which a great battle began. The enemies were panicking and losing the battle, because of which they planned to flee, because their commander had already lost. The girl reported to the protagonist that the enemy's defense line collapsed in an instant, and a huge number of soldiers just fled into the forest. The protagonist was happy that everything went according to plan and told everyone to continue to act strictly according to his plan. The girl launched a firework into the sky, which illuminated a huge part of the sky. The soldiers started talking about how they needed to stop the chase and start executing the plan. It turns out that last night before the battle, the protagonist summoned all the heads of the groups, and then began to talk about how the forest was a haven for mountain ghosts. So Fong ordered the mountain to be set on fire. The soldier began to talk about how there were some plants in this place that they were obligated to give to the Yi family in the capital, while the protagonist began to talk about how one should be able to prioritize and protecting one's land was more important than the Yi family's tribute. The soldier began to say that they also tried to explain this issue to the emperor, but he wouldn't listen to them, while Fong asked the soldier to stop saying that he is now in charge of the place, and they should follow his orders, which is why he said that as soon as the signal comes, the soldiers should start burning the mountain. And so this plan was devised and announced. At that time a huge amount of forest was on fire. The protagonist thought that the enemies did not want to come out. They were preparing traps hoping to catch Fong, who was sure that the enemies either come out or burn to ashes. Suddenly the enemy army started coming out of the forest on their animals. One of the enemies started shouting that he would fight and they would win. The military man began to say that everything was going according to plan, because when the enemies were trapped in a dead end, they had no options left but to fight. The soldier began shouting for the soldiers to take up defensive positions, and the soldiers instantly obeyed the order. The enemies couldn't break through the defense of the protagonist's soldiers, while Fong started shouting to the enemies to attack if they wanted to take his life. While approaching the line of battle, Fong instantly attacked a huge number of enemies who were unable to put up any resistance. Fong stood in the middle surrounded by a huge number of bodies of his enemies. The squad leader didn't know what to do because the protagonist was too strong, while the other squad leader started to say that they should retreat as soon as possible, saying that they saw the power of the protagonist, which was beyond all limits. Guy asked the other head how they would justify their catastrophic defeat to the protagonist. He replied that he would put a war promise if he couldn't kill the hero on the second try. He himself would personally commit suicide. The squad leader spoke with a smile on his face that the protagonist was much more interesting than he had imagined. While Fong realized that the enemies didn't intend to fight anymore, the protagonist ordered the soldiers to continue advancing, and after they could reach the top of the mountain, they were to start building defenses. The protagonist announced that when he was away, the girl was to lead the army, while the man was to help her, and the protagonist added that they should immediately punish anyone who showed disobedience. The girl did not understand what the hero wanted to do, and he confessed that he was almost ready to make a breakthrough. The guys were shocked at the speed of the protagonist's growth, because last time he broke through after defeating a great demon, while Fong started to say that the moment they get the Herbsy monster, they should also prepare for the breakthrough. The guys thanked the protagonist. A while later, Fong sat alone and his aura surrounded his body. He thought about the fact that the enemies had at least 4 Void Realm Masters, and that he needed to gain strength as soon as possible. Fong instantly made a breakthrough to level 2 Grand Master, after which Fong began to undress thinking that in his past life, he didn't remember anything about mountain ghosts, and he wondered how they appeared. The protagonist thought that the emperor just like him didn't know much about the enemies and just used him as a bargaining chip to get more data. The protagonist began to think that there might be some incredible power behind the enemy clan. For several days the mountain ghosts did not cause any inconvenience. Taking advantage of the time, the protagonist helped his men to make a breakthrough. The protagonist also delivered the pills that his pavilion had prepared. The protagonist stood with his warriors who were fully prepared for the coming battle. While the other side raised their flags, they had also finished their military preparations, and were moving towards the protagonist with a huge army. All the enemies were moving towards the protagonist's fortress. Suddenly, one soldier noticed something in the sky, then instantly received several arrows in his body, and screamed in pain. Another soldier instantly raised the alarm, for they were being attacked by the enemy. The soldiers instantly began to gather, for they needed to confront their enemies. The head of the enemy squad began to say that now it was time for them to start a real battle, after which a large number of people prepared to shoot from the bow, while one of the soldiers ordered the others not to panic and realize their strategy. The soldiers instantly grabbed their bows. There was a strange thing on the arrowhead that emitted black smoke. Then they attacked with a huge number of arrows to their enemies, and a thick fog began to spread across the surface of the sky. The enemy started talking about the protagonist using useless tactics against him, and suddenly a huge number of explosions started appearing in the sky. The enemy couldn't believe that the protagonist had figured out how to use the bomb against them. While Fong stood on the wall and watched carefully, he asked about the man's situation, and he began to say that the bombs worked just fine, as they needed. The protagonist looked at the battlefield and said that they had already managed to destroy the formation of the enemy wind group, and assumed that soon other troops would appear. A moment later, there was an explosion, after which the enemies who were going to win this war in every possible way began to emerge from the hole in the rock. The protagonist started talking about how he needed brave soldiers to help him take the enemy general's head off. While the enemy used some strange power, he controlled the rocks so that there was a direct path over the wall, while the protagonist was surprised that the enemy was actually able to control the rock to build a bridge. The enemy general instantly ordered the soldiers to capture the fortress and kill everyone inside, and the soldiers instantly started to carry out the order, while the protagonist grabbed his sword and prepared to attack this bridge. Suddenly, someone was able to stop the protagonist's attack and prevented him from destroying the bridge, causing a huge number of enemies to come closer and closer to the protagonist's soldiers. The protagonist was physically stronger than his opponent, which said that Fong after this battle will definitely come to an end. The enemy instantly tried to attack the hero with his dagger, while Fong easily knocked the enemy's weapon out of his hands, saying that the enemy was too arrogant. Then he instantly attacked the enemy's body, and blood instantly rushed from the wound. The enemy started flying from the protagonist, who instantly struck the bridge with his sword, causing it to start collapsing. The protagonist began to say that he knew that the enemies would attack stealthily, and that he had prepared, and the bridge was destroyed so that the enemies would not even have a chance to come down. The soldiers of the protagonist began to win the battle against the enemies, while the enemy air forces suffered losses from bomb blasts. The protagonist, with a confident look, declared that as long as he was in this place, this fortress would never fall. The enemy began shouting that he would definitely finish off the protagonist, after which huge monsters appeared and were ordered to finish off the protagonist. One of them instantly attacked the guy at a tremendous speed. The enemy was sure of victory because this monster was known for its incredible poison, and he assumed that the hero will completely dissolve in the poison. While the protagonist was out of sight, and a moment later the monster fell to the ground, spitting out a huge amount of his blood, which surprised the enemy. Fong was surprised that they tried to kill him with a pitiful pet not even in the realm of the void, while the enemy could not understand how the protagonist managed to kill his pet so easily. Suddenly the guys noticed a movement of air. It turned out that it was the head of another squad, who apologized to the guy for the fact that his air squad was completely defeated. The enemy began to shout that they need to unite forces to defeat the protagonist, and together they entered the battle. One of the monsters attacked the enemy with feathers and sent them towards the protagonist, while Fong retreated a bit surprised that the feathers were incredibly sharp. The enemy started shouting that Fong would definitely not be able to withstand the onslaught of two mountain ghost captains, and then prepared to attack. Fong instantly felt a rush of pain, then quickly fell to his knees without realizing what was happening. While the enemy was right next to Fong and leaned the knife against his throat saying that he would take the protagonist's head as a trophy, suddenly Fong began to dissolve into thin air. The enemy did not understand why the protagonist just started to disappear, while the protagonist was surprised that the enemy was so interested in fighting with the residual image, which shocked the enemy. The second enemy instantly attacked with his bow, assuming that the protagonist was now very vulnerable, while Fong easily caught the arrow flying at him, then instantly prepared to send it flying back. Then the guy threw the arrow with all his might towards his enemy, who was instantly wounded by his own arrow without realizing how this could be possible. The enemy was ready to attack. He thought that it was just a great opportunity to kill the protagonist. Then the hand of the hero instantly touched the enemy's face, and the enemy in a split second was sealed to the ground with great force. The enemy didn't understand how this was possible. His whole body felt terrible pain, while Fong said that the enemy was too weak to fight him. While the other enemy couldn't believe that the protagonist was such a strong opponent, all the opponents had suffered a huge setback in this battle. They had lost to the protagonist dryly. The enemy could not believe that his group was completely destroyed. He instantly jumped on his pet, thinking that he needed to escape from this hell as soon as possible. Then he instantly began to try to fly away. The protagonist noticed this and looked at the enemy, then instantly jumped from his seat at a great speed, flying towards the enemy. And being in the air, Fong struck a lightning-fast blow directly at the pet of the enemy, then landed on the head of the bird, causing it to fall to the ground at a great speed, leaving a crater in it from the force of his fall. The enemy was on the verge of death, and mumbled something about the battle being over, and they had suffered a complete defeat to the protagonist. The girl started running towards the protagonist, reporting that they had defeated the enemy with almost no soldiers lost. The protagonist began to say that now it is left to find 2 mountain ghosts of the Kingdom of Emptiness and hand them over to the court. Suddenly, a man appeared behind the protagonist's back, which made the guy instantly look in the direction where the old man from the clan of mountain men had appeared. The enemy instantly finished off his subordinate right in front of the protagonist's eyes. The enemy lay without giving any signs of life, while the enemy stood and seemed to take no action. The protagonist instantly summoned his pet, which very quickly created a barrier over the other enemy's body, and blocked the attack of the strange old man who was trying to kill his own men. The enemy was surprised that the protagonist was able to block his attack. He thought that Fong really turned out to be incredibly talented. Suddenly there were soldiers of the protagonist, who were raring to fight to protect Fong from the enemy. They instantly surrounded the old man, and prepared to attack him all together. As the old man began to talk about how the guys should consider this day to be their lucky day, the old man instantly began to fall under the ground, shocking all the soldiers who didn't realize what was happening. While the enemy said that the hero should continue to fight, and then finally said that he will definitely destroy not only this fortress but all the teachings of days. After that, the protagonist sat the enemy in front of him and began to interrogate him. The enemy didn't understand why Fong had saved him and used expensive pills to bring him back to normal. The protagonist started talking about how the old man wanted to kill the guy very badly, then asked the guy to prove that he could be useful. The protagonist said that the old man was a master of the Void Realm, and suggested that he was the real leader of the mountain ghosts. The enemy felt terrible because they trusted this man, and he treated them as pawns, and then he decided to tell the protagonist. He began to say that the old man was a representative from the Celestial Temple, which was officially their ally. He began to talk about how the old man had shown them a lot of friendliness in helping them break through to the realm of the void. He talked about how the man's power was unfathomable. The guy started yelling that this was how their clan was becoming more and more dependent on this old man, and when they noticed it, it was too late, and they just couldn't disobey this man. The protagonist was surprised that the place named Heavenly Temple was as important as the Moon Palace. The protagonist thought that the Celestial Temple was a place where all aspects were developed to incredible levels and they had a colossal amount of secrets. The protagonist realized that the Celestial Temple had raised the mountain ghosts as puppets and then sent them as cannon fodder to take over the fortifications. The protagonist realized that the old man's main goal was to create an entire puppet dynasty. Fong touched the guy's shoulder, then looked him in the eyes and proposed a deal. While the head of the mountain ghosts was surprised at the old man's words that all the units sent out had been defeated, and the old man said that was the case. One of the squad leaders started shouting that if they had let him go, they would have won the war long ago. The old man said that a man would actually go this time, and he hoped he could win, while the man promised that he would bring his men the head of the protagonist. The next day all the warriors gathered at the order of the protagonist. They were preparing to strike back at the Mountain Ghost clan and destroy them. The army of the protagonist moved according to the instructions of the prisoner who helped them with the route. After a long journey, the protagonist's army finally reached the territory of the Mountain Ghosts. The enemies instantly prepared to attack. They wanted to avenge the protagonist for the death of their comrades. The protagonists started shouting that the enemy had launched their attack, and said that this was their last battle, and the one who would show great achievements would receive just a huge amount of pills. The soldiers were incredibly happy with such words. They were going to fight with all their might. While the protagonist began to approach the enemies with his incredibly motivated army. Suddenly Fong noticed a very bright light that was in the distance. It turned out to be a huge egg, which in just a few moments was very close to the protagonist, after which it instantly hit the ground, causing a huge number of soldiers to be injured. The egg instantly opened, and it turned out to be an incredibly strong pet, as well as its owner, who said that he intends to fight the protagonist. The enemy launched an incredibly strong attack with the words that if Fong did not show up, he would simply destroy his entire army. After that, a huge number of soldiers fell under the influence of the enemy's technique and were on a hair's breadth from death. The enemy was incredibly happy about what he saw before his eyes, while the protagonist appeared right above his head, and with the words that he would give death to his enemy, he prepared to attack. Fong attacked, but the enemy was able to dodge this lunge. He then jumped and was behind the protagonist's back. The enemy then began to rejoice that Fong had finally arrived. The enemy began to shout that it was today that the protagonist would die. The enemy covered his weapon with flames. Then, emitting a huge amount of fire, he began to say that he is the strongest among the heads of the squad. The enemy began to move towards the protagonist at a great speed, going to make a strong lunge. While Fong blocked this incredible attack, the protagonist could not cope with the pressure of attacks from his enemy, because the sword of the enemy was too hot, and it had a bad effect on the hero. The enemy began to shout that the weapon of the protagonist was really not bad, since it could withstand so many blows from the sword of this man. The hero was instantly behind the back of his enemy, preparing to check the attack with the words that the enemy is too much talk. Suddenly, the protagonist's blow went through the enemy, after which the flames began to approach Fong under the words of the enemy that it was just his explosive illusion. The enemy watched from afar as the explosion was about to happen. A moment later, the battleground was completely covered in dense flames from the huge explosion. The enemy began to laugh, and declared that any man who met his flames would instantly turn to ash, and a moment later he received an incredibly fast sword strike right on his back. The enemy immediately looked back, not realizing what had just happened, while the protagonist was surprised that the enemy actually believed he was so easy to deal with. The enemy didn't understand how the protagonist managed to survive his blow, while the protagonist started talking about how the fire pill meant nothing to people who don't understand alchemy. The enemy began to cough up his own blood, then began to smile with the words that the hero had managed to awaken his fighting spirit. Suddenly Fong instantly found himself right in front of his opponent, wondering if the enemy in such a state really believed that he could fight. The protagonist instantly struck both the enemy and his pet with an incredibly strong blow, saying that the man was not worthy to do battle with him. The enemy instantly fell to the ground, splattering everything around him with his blood, while the protagonist looked at the corpse of his defeated enemy with contempt. At that time, the old man watching the battle couldn't believe that Fong was so strong. He became angry and decided that he could only rely on himself to fight the protagonist. He instantly attacked the protagonist, saying that it was time for Fong to accept his fate, while the protagonist instantly reacted to his opponent's lunge and blocked it safely. Fong was surprised that the old man couldn't stay still, and then the protagonist instantly sent his enemy flying with a single sword movement. The old man landed on the ground, not realizing what was happening. The enemy became angry at the protagonist for daring to spoil his plans, and promised that this very day Fong would definitely die on this battlefield. The enemy instantly launched a huge number of fireballs towards the protagonist, who summoned his pet, which immediately created a wall of vines that could protect Fong from the fire attack. The enemy didn't realize how such a thing was possible and what kind of monster he was fighting, while the protagonist assumed that it was a secret technique of the old man's palace, while mocking the enemy's strength. The enemy instantly became furious. He began to shout that he was a great man who had opened and expanded the territory for his palace, then began to attack again. While Fong stopped the enemy's attack and ordered his pet to act, and he instantly tied the old man in his vines, which shocked the enemy, because he was at such a high level he couldn't even move. Fong asked if the old man had any last words, while the enemy got even angrier, and then said that because of the protagonist he would have to use the secret weapon of his sect, and then blue aura flashes appeared from the old man's body, which carried the daggers at a great speed towards the protagonist. Fong instantly used his pet's vines to defend against this attack. While the attack easily penetrated the pet's vines without slowing down, the protagonist was shocked by the power of this attack and didn't seem to know what to do. Then at the last moment Fong was able to dodge the attack, while the sword started to return to the enemy, who was able to free himself from the protagonist's trap, saying that he didn't expect to have to use his last resort. The old man began to say that as soon as he used this technique, his enemy would be finished. While the protagonist was surprised that this man's trump card was some kind of flying sword, the old man began to talk about how he was the only reason the people of the Void Realm appeared in the Mountain Ghost clan, and then with a crazy look, he began to talk about how he himself was a true second-level master of the Void Realm. The protagonist recognized that his opponent was indeed stronger than those he had fought before, but he was confident thanks to his blade. The enemy started shouting that the protagonist would definitely not be able to resist this attack, after which the old man started his strike, and 3 blades started flying towards the protagonist, who instantly repelled the enemy's attack with his sword, destroying the enemy's swords. Fong was completely confident in his strength, and was surprised that the enemy piously believed in his victory. While the old man didn't understand how his incredibly strong swords could be destroyed, he immediately tried to escape from the protagonist, who immediately started chasing after him and after a moment caught up with his enemy and struck him with a powerful blade strike. While the enemies couldn't believe what had just happened, as the strongest man on their side had just fallen from the blade of the protagonist. While the allies were incredibly happy that they had won this battle. With the death of the old man, the mountain ghosts completely lost their hope of victory, at which time the protagonist made an agreement whereby the Qin clan promised to protect the remnants of the mountain ghosts from the Yi clan's attack. The price for the protection was the service of the Qin family, and the heads of the mountain ghosts instantly bowed to the protagonist. The head began to show the place where all the items of the deceased old man were kept, while the protagonist noticed a book lying on the table. The protagonist was surprised to read the title of the book, as it described the style of wielding the demonic blade that the protagonist had. The protagonist assumed that the old man was able to recognize the sword, and wondered if their family had a manual on how to wield it. The protagonist began to look at the book and realized that it was just a fragment, and he was going to make a trip to the Heavenly Palace soon. After the Emperor became aware of the protagonist's victory, he instantly ordered Fong to report to the capital, while the Ghost Clan had to go to the protagonist's city immediately after finishing their business. As the military men said goodbye to the protagonist, they talked about how they were willing to serve Fong again at any time. The man said that they should have received good rewards for the deed they had done, while the protagonist was just hoping that the Emperor would at least stop causing trouble. The protagonist and his men were finally able to return to the capital. The Emperor began to question the protagonist about how exactly he was able to win the battle with the mountain ghosts. He looked directly at the protagonist, who was also looking at the Emperor intently. The Emperor began to inquire about how the protagonist was able to defeat a strong man in the Void Realm, smiling thinking he could embarrass Fong. Fong started talking about how the people of the Void Realm were created thanks to the Celestial Palace pills supplied by the old man. The Emperor was shocked that the Heavenly Palace was involved in all of this, as the power of this place was just at a huge level. The people began to worry because if such a strong opponent came at them with weapons, they would not be able to survive. At that time, the protagonist said that the palace is sure to attack soon, and it's just a matter of time. The people were very scared. They did not know what to do, because they will not be able to win. While the Emperor began to smile, and then began to get up from his throne. He started to say that now was the moment to unite, and said that he had a great idea. The Emperor started shouting that they should gather all their forces to support the Moon Palace. Then he could help them in the battle against the Celestial Palace. The clan heads were shocked after hearing this proposal. The protagonist assumed that the Yi family was now trying to just absorb all the other families. At that time, the Emperor asked the Qin family to provide a huge amount of rare pills. The prince smiled cheekily and said that he would like to sincerely thank the Qin family for their cooperation. At that time, the protagonist thought that because he had raised his family, it was not difficult for them to provide such a large amount of medicine, but he was worried about the other families. After a few days near the Nangong family, a girl began to inquire about the purpose of the prince's visit. The prince started to talk about how the emperor had already issued a decree, while the Nangong family's fulfillment process was too slow. The girl was very angry after hearing those words, while the head started talking about how their robot was too complicated and she asked for a delay for a while. The prince started to say that the Nangong family had to make it in time because it directly affects the security of the country, and then he threatened that if they didn't make it in time, the entire Nangong family would be sent to prison for treason. The prince laughed at the top of his voice and started to leave. At that time, the girl was furious. She was well aware that the Yi family was just trying to enrich themselves on their families. A little while later, the guy asked if the prince came to the girl, and she said that he did and he was just crazy. The protagonist started talking about how if the emperor didn't have power he wouldn't have dared to act like that. Fong assumed that the emperor had managed to break through to the realm of the void. The guys couldn't believe what the protagonist said, while the protagonist said that the Yi family didn't dare to treat them like this before, and the emperor had definitely obtained the strength of the first level of the void realm. This information shocked the guys. They were well aware that if they didn't obey, the emperor would try to annex their families by force. The guys were angry because if they disobeyed, they would die. The girl assumed that the protagonist must have a way to deal with this. The guy also hoped that the protagonist could think of something. While the protagonist began to smile and talk about how it was time for the emperor to give up his throne. A little while later, the protagonist was talking to the girl. He said that the journey would be dangerous and asked if she could handle it. The girl started to leave with the words that she would definitely fulfill the protagonist's plan perfectly, while Fong silently watched the girl leaving. The protagonist thought about the fact that his incredible plan had just begun its fulfillment. The next day, the emperor was informed that the protagonist had arrived. Fong asked what the emperor wanted from him, and he began to tell him that the lunar palace had been attacked and the sacred land had been completely destroyed. The protagonist was surprised and asked if it was an accident. The emperor began to say that the protagonist must go to that place to restore the sacred land. The protagonist began to apologize for not being able to carry out this order, because after creating the pills for the palace, his family's supplies were empty. The emperor started talking about how they needed to return the spiritual lands as soon as possible. The emperor said that as long as the hero was busy restoring the spiritual lands, the Qin family would not need to provide the pills. The emperor also began to say that if Fong did everything right, he would provide excellent rewards. The protagonist began to say that he agreed to help with the emperor's order, while thinking that this was exactly what he wanted. The protagonist immediately gathered his men and set off. The guys discussed that after the hero had traveled and it was time for them to begin preparations. After a few days of traveling, the protagonist and his men arrived at the Moon Palace. Fong sat and ate the dish the girl gave him while the new head of the place moved towards the protagonist. She greeted Fong, who instantly asked him not to waste time on pleasantries and asked to see the affected lands, to which the head told the hero to follow her. At that time, the sacred lands were in total devastation. It seemed they had been completely destroyed. Fong began to say that the culprit knew exactly what he was doing and had destroyed the lands to the ground, whereupon the hero asked if the head knew who could have done such a thing. The girl started yelling that it was definitely the daughter of the previous head of the place, then called her a real villain. The girl complained that although the girl's mother had betrayed the palace, she had kept her alive, and had gotten evil for the good she had done for the girl. The protagonist asked the girl not to worry, and promised to take care of the restoration of these lands. The chapter was incredibly happy, for they had appealed to other masters of alchemy as well, and there was nothing they could do. Thank you so much to everyone who watched the video to the end. If you liked it even a little bit, please share your opinion in the comments. And I will continue to try to please you with videos as often as possible. Thank you all again for your support in the comments, likes, and that you subscribe to the channel, joining our ranks. Don't forget that tomorrow at the same time will be Lloyd, so don't miss it. Thank you all, bye.